Welcome to an introduction to Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift, published in 1726 in England and Ireland. This is part one of an overview and introduction for Year 12 English Extension 1 elective, Reimagine Worlds for William Clark College. In this presentation, we'll have a look at the syllabus, the key questions, key aspects of Swift's Milieu and Zeitgeist, key features of genre and satirical form, and key features of style. In the second part, we'll have a look at the key themes and features in each of Swift's 4 journeys through the eyes of Gulliver. But first, we start with the Reimagine Worlds syllabus. In this elective, students explore and evaluate the textual representations of a variety of reimagined worlds that challenge or confirm the known, question the unknown, and explore the possibilities of different realities. So you can look in that first section, we move from the known worlds to the unknown worlds and the possibilities of different realities. So that movement from the known to the unknown, we know as the theory of defamiliarization, which is a Russian formalist idea advocated by Shklovsky. The next thing that we do in this unit is analyse the way texts invite responders to reevaluate understandings and perceptions of their own world, and the way text can offer creative, provocative, and other insights into humanity. Now, you will recognise these aims as being very similar to the first unit that you study in Year 12, which is Text and Human Experiences, which is not a surprise really, because all texts in English look at human experiences. The difference between this and what you might do in advanced, in that our textual analysis goes a little bit deeper into the theory, and we just take it a bit further. So Extension English is literally just that. We extend the English course that you're already studying. So we're looking at provocative, creative, and other insights into humanity. The next thing that you'll be doing is considering the potential of text to push the boundaries of the imagination in creating new texts and alternate experiences. So by pushing the boundaries of the imagination, the texts in this particular element, in this particular elective, are often non-mimetic. So they're non-realistic. So a mime or a mimetic text is a realistic text. So literature in this particular unit moves beyond realism. So one of the first places we often go with moving beyond realism is fantasy, fairy tales, science fiction, magical realism, romanticism, and anything that moves us beyond. So that text actually, this unit can even include gaming, particularly with its fantasy elements. In this elective, students critically evaluate how text, so notice it's critically evaluate. So we go deep as we unpack how these texts do what they do. Okay, so students critically evaluate how texts challenge and reflect the cultural contexts in which they have been composed, and how values and assumptions, both of their own and those of the composers, shape meaning. So again, you'll recognise some of these aims as being very similar to text and human experience. So we're looking at insights into humanity, but how these insights challenge and reflect the cultural context of the authors, but also how they challenge us to reassess and reevaluate our known assumptions. So we're moving beyond what we know, and this is the first goal: challenge or confirm the known, question the unknown, and explore the possibilities of different realities. So those different realities can be just different experiences by different people, which is what you will do in Year 12 Advanced, but also different realities as in other worlds, which is why it's reimagined worlds. Okay, so the second part of the syllabus, in their responding and composing, students explore, analyse, experiment with, and critically evaluate their prescribed texts and other appropriate texts. They, that is you, write their own imaginative compositions that represent insights into humanity through imagined worlds. And of course, this is very similar to what you will do in text and human experiences as well, including what you will do in Module C, the craft of writing. In this elective, students are required to study at least 3 of the prescribed texts, including at least 2 extended print texts, as well as other texts of their own choosing. And at least 2 related texts must be studied. I'm going to reiterate that. 2 related texts must be studied and analysed. So those are 2 texts of your own choosing and 3 texts that we will study in this course. And so the 3 texts that we will study are Gulliver's Travels, 1726, which is a satirical parody of a travelogue. Then we'll have a look at Guillermo del Toro's magical realist Gothic fantasy Pan's Labyrinth. And then we'll have a look at a postmodern science poet who is the Poet Laureate of the US, Tracy K. Smith, and her collection of poetry from Life on Mars. So we're looking at texts from, and this is the next point, texts drawn from a range of times, contexts, and media. So we have a satirical travelogue, we have a magical realist Gothic film, and we have a postmodern collection of poetry. We have different contexts that we have England in the Age of Enlightenment. We have Spain looking at post-World War II and the post-Civil War Spain. And then we have contemporary and the recent past in American society. And obviously they're different media as well. So we're looking at the possibility of texts. Now, I've made this larger because this is, again, the focus to offer insights into humanity through imagined worlds. We're looking at a variety of times, a variety of situations, and a variety of texts to look at how they offer insights into humanity through imagined worlds. And that's this non-mimetic, so it's the moving beyond reality. So these are the key questions that are actually in your booklet. And what I've done here is just to show you how they correlate to your syllabus document. So everything that we do in this course comes back to the syllabus document. So the questions are in white and the connections to the syllabus are in yellow and green. So the first question is, how does the representation of their reimagined world shape or reflect the composer's zeitgeist and milieu? So zeitgeist is the broader cultural context and milieu is their personal experience within that cultural context. And you can see the links to the syllabus there. The second question is, how can pushing the boundaries of the imagination lead to new insights about ourselves and our world? So pushing the boundaries of the imagination. And this is the non-mimetic elements of this unit. The third question is, how can the representation of different realities lead to challenging or confirming of the known? So this is pushing the boundaries of different realities and the imagination. And again, these are the non-mimetic elements of text within this particular unit. The fourth question, is how do composers and responders' assumptions guide the interpretation of a text? And of course, we're following in the footsteps of Roland Barthes and his theories of death of the author. So once an author sets their text kind of free in the world, they unshackle it from their own mind and it's published and released to fly out into the great yonder. It is up to us as the responders, as the audience, to respond to the texts. And so how do these particular texts shape our own assumptions? And how do our own assumptions, in addition, shape or influence how we interpret a text? And so this particular question requires a balance between the 2 literary theorists, Greenblatt and Barthes. So Barthes, as I've already mentioned, is death of the author, and Greenblatt looks at the new historicism. So we have to look at the original cultural context and milieu of the author to try to interpret the text initially as much as we can with the author's intent, as much as you can get into the mind of the author. Also understanding that the authors themselves often change their interpretation over time. So that's a double-edged element there. So we're looking at New Historicism, which is Greenblatt, and The Death of the Author, which is the theories by Roland Barthes. So there's two theorists that you can keep in mind with those questions from the syllabus. Okay, so let's have a look at the text. So we'll start with Swift's Milieu and his Zeitgeist. So remember, the milieu is the personal context, and the Zeitgeist is the broader spirit of the time, because Geist is spirit and Zeit is time. It's a fabulous word from German. And of course, we can thank a lot of our literary terms that we use to German philosophers. So they have a lot of great philosophers about literary theory, and we've stolen their best words. And milieu is a word that comes from French. So as we know, the English is a bit of a gypsy language. We swipe things as we go. So we have milieu, which is a French term, and Zeitgeist, which is German. Okay, so let's have a look at these key ideas. Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels was first published in 1726 under the title Travels into Several Remote Nations of the World. So that would have been quite an evocative title at the time, because it was at the time of the Age of Enlightenment, and it was also at the era that Britain was expanding its economic imperialism around the world. So the trade routes were developing, and they're expanding their influence all over the world and basically stealing what they could from other nations. So the travel to remote nations was actually quite an interesting idea. This book was published just after some other famous travelogues as well. So Swift has actually stood on the shoulders of other writers, or recent writers who've gone before him. The fantastical narrative was initially presented as a travelogue and factual account written under the guise of Lemuel Gulliver, first a surgeon, then a captain of several ships. So he's disguised his authorship and pretended that it's actually factual. So some people would have bought it and read it thinking it was actually just scientific and factual, because this was all the rage at the time in the Age of Enlightenment. And one of the big scientific theories at that time, or the scientific practices, was about observation. So anyone could be a science if they carefully observe the natural world. And so obviously we see that in Lemuel Gulliver's account. So it's that careful observation. So it was pseudoscience. Early editions of the book even included a fabricated portrait of Gulliver in his role as author. So he went to a lot of trouble to pretend that this Lemuel Gulliver was actually the author and that it was factual. So it's very much a literary performance. The letter accompanying the second edition, which was 1735, furthered this literary performance by Gulliver. And this 1735 edition is actually the one that we refer to today, because the initial publication in 1726 by the publisher Mott actually had a lot of errors in it, partly because Mott was scared for his life because other people had been murdered or prosecuted and imprisoned for publishing treasonous tracts, such as this one by Swift. Okay, so let's have a look at a little bit more about the Georgian era. So the Georgian, which is where the era that Swift published. The Georgian era was named after the reigns of the Georges. So there's a whole line of them. So you have George I, George II, George III, George IV. Maybe they ran out of names in that family, but all the kings' firstborn sons were named George. And it was a period of major economic, social and cultural upheaval in Britain. So lots was changing, partly because of the increased travels around the world. This was the time that Britain became a modern global superpower. So you have all these stories of rule Britannia, Britannia ruled the sea, and this actually originated from this era. And this set the stage for the world that we live in today and all the great travel routes and the exchange of ideas. And people in Britain at this time were actually very hungry for ideas. Only the middle class and upper class were educated, but society as a whole, their zeitgeist was one of intellectual hunger. Okay, this period exhibited exceptionally bold political writings in all genres. Now, one of the reasons for that was because only the super rich and powerful were able to have a political voice. So that's all those lords and ladies. Everyone else didn't have a say. So it was it was a constitutional monarchy, but your average Joe Blow didn't get to vote. Your average Joe Blow couldn't read either. So the main form of political dissent at this time was actually satire. So satirical tracts, satirical art cartoons, satirical posters, satirical everything. It was a bit like our modern society that everyone seems to resort to memes. So memes are basically satire as well. So you have memes of memes of memes, and that was exactly the same in this Georgian era. So you had satires of satires of satires. So you have layers of meanings and lots of little in-jokes. It was a very popular and very powerful form of political commentary. So in terms of broader literary ideas, this is a literary epoch that featured the rapid development of the novel form. And in fact, Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels was one of the first published novels. And the reason for that was some of the recent adaptations or recent engineering feats for publishing books. So even though it was still by our standards very labour intensive, it was much easier. So there was an explosion in satire, which I've already mentioned, the mutation of drama from political satire into melodrama. So they liked extremes, and of course a lot of memes and TikTok things. It's all about the melodrama, isn't it? It's about sucking as much emotion and humour out of a particular incident as you can. So our generation or your generation understands satire and melodrama. It was an evolution towards poetry of personal exploration. So after this, we have the Romantic era, and some of the poets, one of the poets set for study in our particular elective, Samuel Coleridge, is a very famous Romantic poet, and he's looking at reimagining your interior life, so personal exploration. This era was dominated by the philosophical idea of empiricism, which I've already mentioned briefly. It's the theory that all knowledge is based on experience derived from the senses. So that's the powers of observation and from the rise of experimental science. Because science, as we know, it wasn't the thing then. They were still kind of developing their scientific methodology. So empiricism or careful observation was the way that they went about it. And we see lots of evidence of that, of course, in our travelogue. The philosophical ideas of the writings of political economy, and these are ideas that we see very much throughout the political commentary, particularly in the first 2 or 3 journeys of Gulliver. Other philosophies of this era include the evolution of mercantilism, which is an economic imperialism. And we see this evident in Gulliver's Travels through the ships, the mercantile ships or the trade ships travelling around the oceans, of which Gulliver worked on some and hitched a lift on others. So they were everywhere. And then we have the development of capitalism and the triumph of international trade. And of course, that's evident also in some of the economic commentary of particular journeys and also of Gulliver himself as he tried to sell off some of the curiosities that he found in his travels, such as the miniature sheep from Lilliput and things like that. More about the Zeitgeist, so the broader idea, it was in the age of the Enlightenment, so people have come out of the Dark Ages and they're starting to think about things. So that's intellectual and philosophical movement. It's actually often called humanist movement that dominated the world of ideas in Europe during the 17th and 19th centuries. So we actually see the ideas of humanist enlightenment coming out in some of the writings of William Shakespeare as well. And Hamlet is a very clear play about the role of the person or the individual being just as important as the community and the family. And also in Hamlet, you see the rise in ideas about intellectual curiosity and university and things like that. So you don't see that in some of other of Shakespeare's plays, but it's very, very evident in Hamlet in particular. So, and he's a few years before Jonathan Swift. So the Enlightenment emerged out of a European intellectual and scholarly movement known as Renaissance humanism. So again, that's what influenced Shakespeare. And it was also preceded by a scientific revolution and the idea of advancement and progress of society. So these are things that are very powerfully evident in Gulliver's travelogue, particularly in the style and the detail, all the little details such as measurement and some of his very finite observation. And this also develops the verisimilitude of the setting. So we believe he is where he is because the details are so believable. The other way that this idea of science is evident is particularly in his third journey. So that's to Laputa and some of the other islands that focus on scientific discovery and scientific method. Okay, so science during the Enlightenment was dominated by scientific societies and academies such as the Royal Academy. And Swift particularly pokes fun at the Royal Academy. And there's some very funny references to scientific experiments that are actually apparently came from real scientific experiments that people were conducting that really had no real purpose for the advancement of humanity. So there's a bit of criticism about scientific focus, particularly in Gulliver's Third Journey. In terms of philosophy, the beginning of the Enlightenment is often linked to René Descartes' 1637, so that's 100 years before Swift's, his philosophy of cognito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. Now, we have encountered that philosophy in our Year 11 course as well, and we've looked at the philosophy of a contemporary lady called Shoshana Zuboff, and she has reworked Descartes' theory to I buy and I do, therefore I am, and her philosophy reflects modern capitalism. Okay, so let's go back to the Enlightenment. Enlightenment includes a range of philosophical ideas centered on the sovereignty of reason over emotion, and that is attacked in the fourth journey to the land of the Houyamans, where the horse society functions purely on reason without compassion and emotion. So it's a very dry, very heartless society. One of the other philosophical ideas, as we've mentioned a few times, is evidence of the senses or empiricism as a primary source of knowledge, and advanced ideals such as liberty, progress, toleration, and fraternity. Now, some of these you might actually recognise from terms from the French Revolution. So liberté, equality, and fraternity. So these are common ideas throughout all of Europe and the Western world, so not just Britain. So these are considered the science of man, and this was a new area of study, and that actually came from Scotland. So Scotland termed the study of the science of man, which now we think of as modern sociology. One of the other Enlightenment ideas that was debated and discussed at great length was the idea of constitutional government. So that's the opposite to a monarchy, and the separation of church and state. So in the time of Swift, the Christian church had incredible influence on government, and that's not just in Ireland and Britain, but also throughout the Western world. We see it in Russia and France and Germany and Belgium and the whole Western Europe. that the church was actually a powerful arm of government. So this idea that church and state should be separate, and Swift was all for that. He doesn't go into it in great detail in this particular novel, but he does elsewhere. That's some of the ideas of the Enlightenment. Now let's have a look, zoom in a little bit, and we'll have a look at some of how that impacted Swift himself. So Swift was a man with one foot in Ireland and the other foot in England. So he kind of had a dual identity and a dual nationality. So in the novel, he writes a lot about his concerns about Ireland. So let's have a look. So denied union with England in 1707 when Scotland was granted union with England. Ireland continued to suffer under English trade restrictions and found the authority of its own parliament in Dublin severely limited. So even into the 1990s, Ireland has really suffered incredibly under the hands of British control. So that's a long time. So probably already they'd suffered for a long time in this stage. So probably 300 years, Ireland has been considered the poorer and the less able cousin of England. So they really suffered a lot under English rule and power. Swift was born a member of Ireland's colonial ruling class because he had English heritage, but he became to be known as one of the great Irish patriots. So later in his life, he defended the sovereignty and the humanity of Ireland. And so there's a lot of statues for Jonathan Swift throughout Ireland. So he's really considered, even to this day, a great Irish patriot. However, on a personal level, he considered himself more English than Irish, and his loyalty to Ireland was often ambivalent, so that means could go either way, in spite of his staunch support for certain Irish causes. And what actually swayed him was he hated injustice wherever that occurred. So when he saw England subjecting Ireland to things that he considered unjust, then his loyalty was with Ireland. And so it's more that he hated injustice than he was particularly Irish. And because the Irish suffered a lot of injustices, of course, you have the idea that he's an Irish patriot. Swiss Ireland was a country that had been effectively controlled and subjugated. So that's violently controlled by England for nearly 500 years at this point in time. And of course, you can add a few hundred years on top of that now. The English Stuarts, so that's a monarchical regime, had established a Protestant governing aristocracy amid the country's relatively poor Catholic population. So they kept people poor. They stole all the wealth of the country and kept them poor. And it was a serf economy. So you probably studied that in year 7 or year 8. So that meant that the lord or ladies of the manor owned all the lands, they owned people's homes, they owned people's means of production, and in some case they owned them. They were indentured servants, otherwise known as serfs. And that's how you keep people poor and beholden to you. The complicated nature of Swift's relationship with England may have left him particularly sympathetic to the injustices and exploitation Ireland suffered at the hand of its more powerful English nature. I've already said that. So Swift became vehemently engaged in Irish politics from the 1720s. He'd spent a bit of time in England. When he came back, he started to see things through an Irish lens. He reacted to the debilitating effects of English commercial and political injustices with a large body of pamphlets, essays and satirical works, including the perennially popular Gulliver's Travels. That was popular at the time and it continues to be popular. One of his other famous works of satire is A Modest Proposal, which was published in 1729 in response to worsening economic and social conditions in Ireland. And perhaps it's the most extreme and scathing of all Swift's pamphlets, whereas he proposed in order to bolster their economy, England should just start serving and eating Irish babies, because really that's what they were doing. They were causing people to die, so they may as well just eat the babies because that's what they owned them so thoroughly. So key aspects of Swift's milieu. This is a lovely portrait of him by Charles Gervas in 1718 when he was Christian Dean of St Patrick's Cathedral in Dublin, Ireland. This was painted when Swift was about 41, so he was a good age. He's shown seated at his writing table and he's wearing clerical robes. That's the robe of old-fashioned ministers and a clerical collar, and that's the shape of them at that time. Now he also holds a sheaf of writing paper and a quill in his hand. So they used to write with the hollow feather and they'd shape the tip of it, fill it with ink, and that's how they wrote. So it was a messy business writing back in the day. Although Swift's clothing signifies his religious calling, the writing materials and the books behind him, which we can't really see in detail, but so you have to trust me, are works by Aesop, who's a Greek writer, Horace and Lucian, who are great Roman writers, and they're all very, very philosophical. And they emphasise his other vocation or other job as a man of education, and they provide literary precedents for his works of didactic, social and political satire. So if you're not aware of it, that word didactic means a piece of writing or film or poetry or whatever that has an educational intent. So it's didactic, it's teachery. His epigraph on his tomb, which he wrote himself, so everyone should write their own epigraph. This one's translated from Latin and it reads, "Swift has sailed into his rest. Savage indignation there cannot lacerate his breast," which is what they refer to for their heart. "Imitate him if you dare, world-besotted traveller. He served human liberty." So that gives you an insight into his purpose as he understood it himself. He wanted to serve human liberty, and he does that through his role as a church minister and with his savage satire. Okay, so let's have a look at a little bit more personal. So this is more aspects of Swiss milieu. He's born in Ireland. He's spent his early years zipping backwards and forwards between Ireland and England, and he belonged to a literary family with masses of connections to famous poets and even to Shakespeare himself. So after graduating university, which focused on debating skills, he worked in politics. That was also due to family connections. Swift was later ordained in the church as a minister, and that's what he actually studied at university. And ministerial studies in those days focus on the idea of debate and reason. His cutting political writing when he was younger drew the attention of Robert Harley, who was the Tory Prime Minister of England. And he made Swift his chief speechwriter or debater. And there's an interesting anecdote that Swift was living life on the knife's edge of political power, where his writing helped destroy the powerful Duke of Marlborough. So the dukes were one step down from a prince. So you had king, prince, then dukes. They're pretty powerful elite in England, and it led to his threats. And he once defused a mail bomb sent to the Prime Minister before it killed them both. So that's a story to tell your grandkids. Swift returned to Ireland as Dean of St Patrick's Cathedral after the Tories lost power and the Whigs came into power. And you will, of course, recognise some of their political satire in in Gulliver's journey to Lilliput. So he makes very, very obvious satirical critique of the Tories and the Whigs. And in fact, he says, the real only difference between them is 1/18 of an inch. So that's a couple of millimetres. And the only difference between the Trameskins and the Slameskins, who are the Whigs and Tories in Lilliput, was the height of their heel, which is the 1/18 of height difference. So he's making their differences seem quite petty and juvenile. So he's lampooning party politics in his first trip to Lilliput. Gulliver's Travels, Modest Proposal and Drapier's Letters are credited with saving Ireland by defeating unfair English currency policies. So that's the one I've referred to already, a modest proposal, and made him a hero in his homeland. And that's a complicated thing that England was going to do. They're basically going to take all of the coins, which was the way that they didn't have very much paper money. It was mostly coins back in the day. And they're basically going to suck all of the good silver or bronze or gold out of those coins and just basically print them in lead, which made them basically worthless. So the plan had been to strip the Irish Treasury of any value at all, and that was a modest proposal, which is where Swift said, you may as well just eat our babies, you're going to destroy our life. It's a pretty extreme satire. Stubbs reported that when England's new Whig Prime Minister, Sir Robert Walpole, so he's the dude who followed Robert Harley, who was the Prime Minister that Swift worked for, he proposed arresting Swift for satirically mauling him in verse. So that's how influential Swift was, that if he wrote a satirical verse about this Prime Minister, and Sir Robert Walpole wanted to arrest him. And a friend asked him coolly whether he had 10,000 men to spare. That was the size of the army the government would need to take Swift from his loyal Dubliners in Ireland. And Robert Walpole's sensitivity to satire makes me think of Donald Trump. And of course, no English lesson is complete without a reference to Donald Trump. And he's also famously sensitive to critique, particularly in his favourite satirical mode, which is Twitter. And of course, Trump doesn't particularly understand Twitter very well, which makes it so much more entertaining. So you've got all these satirists who are giving Robert Walpole a hard time. The poor old man's got a thin skin and he can't cope, so he wants to arrest and imprison Swift. Very, very Trumpian. Swift was a fastidious conservative priest, and that, of course, aligns with his sense of justness, and he became a king of the mob, rebelling against the established order, which was the social power structures and values, with satire that delved, and here's a quote for you, into the stink of daily life. So that's a juicy quote. So his satire delved into the stink of daily life. And I've got a reference there for an article that you can read further if you're interested. Okay, so Swift published Gulliver's Travels under the pseudonym of Lemuel Gulliver. Why did he do it? Why did he use a pseudonym? Okay, well, let's have a look. The book was politically explosive. His printer, Edward Waters, who'd published his previous political pamphlets, was convicted of seditious libel. That sounds fancy, doesn't it, in 1720. Okay, so this is 6 years before Gulliver's Travels. But 4 years later, a grand jury refused to find that the Drapier's letters, which though written under a pseudonym, were universally known to be Swift's work, were seditious. So Swift often wrote under a pseudonym because he knew what he was doing was quite dangerous and cutting politically. But everyone knew the Drapier's letters were his, and he was, so they couldn't, but because it was published under a pseudonym, they couldn't prosecute him, so they prosecuted his publishers, kind of indirectly making him suffer. So seditious libel is published statements or drawings that are deemed by the legal authority to tend towards insurrection against the established order. Insurrection, what a fabulous word. So basically you can apply it to anyone who doesn't say anything that you like. And again, I think of Donald Trump. Okay, so in Gulliver's Travels, there's a distinct blurring of the boundaries between fact and fiction. So in his real life dealings with his publisher, this is the next publisher, Edward Mott, Swift hides behind a fictional figure. So that's Gulliver Travel and Lemuel Gulliver, and his made-up cousin that later appears in the work itself. So this fictitious writer becomes a part of the fiction itself. So you've got really juicy layers of fiction there, of non-mimetic aspects. Swift himself was so concerned for his personal safety that he arranged to get his manuscript copied, so even his handwriting could not be traced. And after Benjamin Mott published it, he actually destroyed the original manuscript that had come from Swift, so that, again, the handwriting couldn't be traced. But Mott didn't actually even know it was Swift. He probably suspected it, but he didn't know. So because the handwritten or the re-handwritten manuscript was sent anonymously to the publisher. However, Benjamin Mott saw it for the brilliance it was and published it very quickly. Accompanying the manuscript was a letter asking Mott if he would publish Gulliver's Travels, signed by Gulliver's imaginary cousin, Richard Simpson, and Richard Simpson also appears in the novel. So that's those multi-layers of a fictional figure. So Simpson is the author of the prefatory letter, or the first version, to Gulliver's Travels. So the first edition had one prefatory letter, the second edition had two, one from Richard Simpson and one from Lemuel Gulliver himself. Mott was keen, and it was published in October 1726. Very quickly, in fact, so quickly that Swift was unable to correct proof copies of his work before it appeared in print. And when it did appear, actually there's more stories with that, Mott actually had two printing presses going 24 hours a day to get it out quickly as possible. When it did appear, Swift discovered to his horror that not only was it full of misprints, so obviously hadn't been proofread, but also that Mott had deliberately altered the text of several passages. Why? He cut it out or toned down some sections he thought were dangerously outspoken. So clearly, poor old Benjamin Mott wanted to avoid being charged with seditious libel, as was the experience by Edward Waters, who was Swift's previous publisher. Swift was outraged at this invasion of his authorial rights. While many of the misprints were corrected in the next edition, it wasn't until 1735 that Mott's heavy-handed editing of Gulliver's Travels, so that's nearly 9 years later, was removed. Then it appeared in Dublin publisher George Faulkner's multi-volume edition of Swift's work. And this is the version we refer to today. And when we look at images, if you look on the Encyclopaedia Britannica online or the British Library, that you will find images from that edition from Faulkner. And that's the edition that we follow today. And that's because it's closer to Swift's authorial intent without the intervention of Benjamin Mott. Poor old man, he was scared for his life. Okay, now let's have a look at the key literary features that we've looked at. The zeitgeist of the time of the Georgian era, that it was the age of discovery, an age of ideas and the Enlightenment. We looked at Swift's personal milieu, that he was educated and very political, and that he hated injustice, and he had a foot in two worlds between Ireland and Britain. So now let's have a look at some of the key literary features. Okay, so Gulliver's Travel follows a long tradition of fiction and essays that create other worlds that are reimagined variations of contemporary worlds. And if we look at it through the lens of the horses in the land of the humans, which is Gulliver's last journey, it's the thing that is not. So that is fakery. It's a parodic travelogue, so it's a parody of a travelogue. So a travelogue is a record, like a ship's log, of a travel journey. And so that's with that scientific methodology of observation. And it's filled with satirical allegories. So the allegories are the extended metaphors or the ideas that are satirical. So in each journey, Swift has a different focus that he lampoons. The character of Lemuel Gulliver is an elaborate pretense, a literary disguise, or, to quote Axel Cruz, a literary performance by Swift to protect his identity from certain prosecution and punishment. One of the key achievements of Gulliver's Travels is that it's designed to appear altogether honest and direct, so it's quite naive in his style and even innocently naive through Gulliver's non-judgmental recount. That kind of makes it, that develops actually the dramatic irony. And often we see this with unreliable narrators, that the narrator themselves doesn't understand what they're saying. So this is this naivete. And yet it's also sophisticated intellectualism. So behind Gulliver's innocent naivete, you have these really deep philosophical ideas and critiques by Swift himself. So clearly it was something that he thought a lot about. So, and it's also a hell of a fun read. It's an adventurous travelogue in fantastical imagined worlds that seem authentic. So he's developed the verisimilitude so that we understand it. And he's got enough of the known worlds that are familiar to the readers that they feel comfortable. So the aspects that are defamiliarised or made unknown aren't so extreme that they can't be understood. A critical study for this elective needs to concentrate on understanding the complexity of Gulliver's Travels. So this is the words of Axel Cruz, who's one of the teachers of literature at Sydney University. So a critical study of the elective needs to concentrate on understanding the complexities of Gulliver's character as an innocent abroad. So he's innocent or naive, who, despite his innocence, always has a critical view of humanity and society and becomes increasingly horrified by the barbarity and inhumanity of contemporary European civilization and its essential lack of reason and compassion. So the novel becomes increasingly misanthropic as it progresses. So a lot of people associate Gulliver's Travels with those misanthropic elements. And now I've lost my spot. I got too excited about the misanthropy. Okay, so Gulliver's Travels, let's have a look at the style. So it's a first-person account. So it's in this naive style by a distinctive voice that adds apparent directness. Now notice it's apparent directness as well as authenticity with selectively detailed realism. So that's that verisimilitude to develop the veracity of the parodic travelogue. Gulliver's Travels is depicted as a sailor, and he's an everyman. He's the Brit abroad, just as much as Alice in Alice's Adventures in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll, which is, of course, 1865, is also an everyman. So Alice is an everyman, Gulliver's an everyman. He's a quality of ordinariness that makes him seem innocent. He's at least gullible. So his name is a pun of gullible. Gulliver's a literary performance by Swift due to the detail of his letter in the second edition, which wasn't published till 1735. Now, I've mentioned this already. So what I've got for you here is a quote from that second letter. So these are the words of Jonathan Swift, but in the guise of Lumel Gulliver. Okay, so quote, if the censure of the Yahoos could in any way affect him, so remember, Yahoos are humans, I should have great reason to complain that some of them are so bold, so some humans are so bold as to think my book of travels is a mere fiction. Oh, shock horror out of mine own brain, and have gone so far to drop hints that the Hoymans and the Yahoos have no more existence than the inhabitants of Utopia. Okay, so that's interesting because Thomas More's Utopia was published, I think it was in the 1600s, so a few years before this. And of course, the inhabitants of Utopia are also fictitious. So he's really playing games with this idea of what is real and what is not. And he says, quote, so you have made me say the thing that was not. And that's that reference to the Houyhnhnms, and a thing that was not is a lie. Quote, "You were afraid of giving offence, that people in power were very watchful over press and apt not only to interpret, but to punish everything that looked like an innuendo, as I think that you would call it." So again, it's this literary performance. And so he's critiquing here quite directly the people who have taken offence at his writings in this novel. So remember that the second edition is 9 years after the first. So he's having another further dig at them. Like it's pretty hard not to have a dig at Donald Trump, it's pretty hard not to have a dig at the people who are offended by Gulliver's Travels. Okay, so I've got a quote for you here. "Understanding Swift's use of Gulliver as a character and representative of humanity links with understanding that Swift's reimagining of the world is deceptively childish and straightforward, and yet it is a satirically ironic travelogue." So you can use that phrase in your essays. It is a satirically ironic travelogue set in a fantastical dreamscape. So you blend the elements of fantasy or science fiction and a satire. That's a parody of a travelogue. Okay, so let's have a little look at the tradition of satire, because that's really important to understand the form. So this is again more information by the fabulous Axel Cruz. Thanks, Axel. Satire is one of the oldest genres of literature, with a history that links with ancient Greece and Rome. So it's a really old tradition. It had been revived in the Renaissance, and of course the Age of Reason or the Enlightenment is what follows the Renaissance, and in London in the early Georgian period. So that's the period of Swift. In the early 18th century, it was one of the dominant forms of writing in poetry and essays, and the dominant form of political critique. And I might add, it was the only form of political critique at this time. So lots of historians say it was the only form of political critique, but you can at least say it's the dominant form of political critique. Because remember, in this elective, you have to understand the context before you can really draw out the teachings of the text. So according to the classical tradition, satire is a genre concerned with the correction of human follies and vices. That's a really lovely definition of satire, the correction of human follies and vices. And that applies to memes, doesn't it? So a folly is something that we do wrong, or that it's inexplicable why people do it, but they just do it. So maybe they're not malevolent, but they're human failings, and vices are the more malevolent version of that. So things that people that do that are wrong and perhaps destructive to other people. So satire is a genre concerned with the correction of human follies or failings and vices. Now, there's a couple of different types of satire in this novel. It could be in the tradition of Horatian satire from the Roman poet Horace, which is a matter of lightly comic content, so it's not particularly savage. And you'll notice in some of the journeys that it's actually lightly comic. It's not really savage. In other parts of the journeys, the satire is really savage. And that's the tradition of Juvenile satire. And that's another Roman poet called Juvenile. So somebody who's juvenile needs correction. So the Juvenalian satire is a manner of severe and savage comment and correction. And that is Swift's style. So we're looking at savage satire. This tradition allowed for a range from light comedy about contemporary manners and morals to heavy criticism and intellectual complexity. Gulliver's Travels is a satiric variation on comedy as another world. So you're going to another place, you have that element of estrangement or defamiliarization because some things are known, some things are unknown, so you're more open to the critique. And that's in the tradition that descends from a fabulous Greek playwright, Lysistrata, in ancient Greece. So, of course, satire is also familiar to us because of our studies of Alice in Wonderland. And Alice in Wonderland also has that otherworldliness. So that's that defamiliarization. So you have the known idea, which is the white rabbit. White rabbit is defamiliarized. You introduce unknown elements. So the white rabbit's wearing his red waistcoat and carrying his fob watch, and he's talking, and he's late to meet the queen. So you have these familiar elements, so we know what a rabbit looks like, and unfamiliar elements, the rabbit's anthropomorphized. So you have this similar process of defamiliarization in the fantastical components in Gulliver's Travels. So Seditious Libel examines the different natures of satire. So satire is imaginative. It's devastating. It's cutting. It's nasty. Satire is passionate. It's often timely and it's urgent. So we look at Gulliver's Travels satire and we often say that it's temporal. So it's of that time, but it's also timeless. So the misanthropic elements of Gulliver's Travels are definitely timeless, and the more political criticism, and particularly some of the manners of society in Britain, are the temporal or of that time. So satire is often divisive, but it's always earnest. It comes from a place of eliciting change. So if we go back to our previous definition of satire, we see its correction of human follies and vices. So that's the earnestness. Okay, we're nearly finished now. So the satirical features of Gulliver's Travels, it's the biting juvenile satire on society through its use of allegory. It's a parody, so it's sending up the travelogue genre, including at time through the excessive measurements and other details to develop the pseudo-scientific tone. Swift's satire includes these elements: sarcasm, irony, exaggeration, dramatic irony, absurd situations, reversals, puns, strange and juvenile names. And they do this in order to lampoon the pathetic nature of humanity and its institutions and customs. So in the introduction that you write for Reimagined Worlds, you or particularly a paragraph introduction, you have to start with an overview of the text before you zoom into specific criticism and analysis. So you always start with an overview, such as that Gulliver's Travel is biting Juvenalian satire, and it's a parodic travelogue, for example. Okay, and that it lampoons the nature of humanity and its institutions and customs. So you can include those sentences in your introduction. So Gulliver's name is a pun on gullible, so that's another humorous technique, because he represents a naive and gullible traveller who recounts what he sees without judgment, and the beauty of that is it allows the reader to make their own interpretations. So if we look at Coleridge's idea of the suspense of disbelief, is that the reader makes a kind of contract with the writer of a particular text, and we agree to enter the fantastical world or the world of the text. So we suspend disbelief, and by allowing us to make our own interpretations of Gulliver's naive recounts, it actually increases that engagement between the writer and the reader, or the author and the audience. Swift ensures that his novel's both amusing and critical. So if he just wrote an essay critiquing the things that'd be boring as, no one would read it, probably no one would remember it. But because it's in such an amusing form, like Alice in Wonderland was, it's become much more enjoyable to read and much more timeless. Swift bends reality to make ordinary things seem strange and unfamiliar. That's those ideas of the Russian formulas, defamiliarization and estrangement. Swift depicts human customs as weird and alien, asking readers to examine them from a fresh lens. So we talk a lot in this unit about having fresh eyes. So the different forms, particularly the non-mimetic, but also mimetic forms of literature, require us to see or they enable us to see the ideas with fresh eyes or a fresh lens. Swift makes everything from religious and political divisions to maths and science seem frivolous and ridiculous. He finds most things about humans repulsive, reflecting them back to the reader in creatively disgusting ways. He has a particular fascination with who and we. And people's paws and their noses. And that part of that is all the conceit of size. Swift wrote, he had lots of writer friends actually. He wrote to one friend, Alexander Pope, is a very famous writer. He wanted to write Gulliver's Travels in order to vex the world, not to divert it. And that's actually the title in one of the articles that we have linked on our unit page. The ridiculousness of politics is depicted in The Village of Lilliput is a fine stroke, and as John Dryden will put it, attacking British supremacy. Much of the irony in Gulliver's Travels come from the contrast between self-image and reality. So that's the reversals that I mentioned before. The conceit of size is one such reversal, and we see that also in Alice in Wonderland. So the big and the little perspective. Gulliver is constantly full of himself until he is abruptly reminded of his puniness as he falls into cow poop or nearly drowned in a jug of cream. 2 slides to go, so stay with me, peoples. So this second last slide, the causes of Gulliver's misadventures become more malignant, so more dangerous as time goes on. He's first shipwrecked, then abandoned, then he's attacked by strangers, and then he's attacked by his own crew. Gulliver progresses from a cheery optimist at this first part to then a pompous misanthrope at the end. So he really just hates people. He wants to be a horse by the end of the novel. And some people say it's a sign of his own dementia, that they didn't actually understand his biting satire. Each part is a reverse of the preceding part. So they're actually very carefully structured. So Gulliver is big in the first journey, small in the second journey, wise in the third journey, ignorant in the fourth journey. The countries are complex, such as Lilliput, simple, as in Brobdingnag, scientific in Laputa and the others, and then natural, as in the land of the Homans. The governments are worse in Lilliput, better in Brobdingnag, worse in Laputa, and better in Homans than England. Gulliver's viewpoint between parts is mirrored by that of his antagonist in the contrasting part. So he seems to take on the foibles of the land he's just been to. One of the other big ideas is no form of government is ideal. So there is no utopia. Specific individuals may be good, even where a race is bad. So, we are responsible for our own moral ineptitude or our own moral capacity. Okay, this is the last slide. In his letter to the second edition, I just wanted to include more of it here. The author of these travels, Mr. Lemuel Gulliver, is my ancient and intimate friend. The style is very plain and simple. There's an air of truth apparent through the whole, and indeed the author was so distinguished for his veracity, it was as if Mr. Gulliver had spoken it. So this is the letter to the first edition. By the advice of several worthy persons to whom, with the author's permission, I communicated these papers, I now venture to send them into the world, hoping they may be, for at least some time, a better entertainment than the common scribbles about politics and party. There's a little bit of arrogance there. Thank you, Swift. This volume would have been at least twice as large if I had not made bold to strike out innumerable passages relating to the winds and tides. So this is how Swift covered up his lack of nautical knowledge. I resolved to fit the work as much as possible to the general capacity of readers. However, if my own ignorance in sea affairs shall have led me to commit some mistakes, I alone am answerable for them. And if any traveller hath a curiosity to see the whole work at large, and it came from the hand of the author, I'll be ready to gratify him. As for any further particulars relating to the author, the reader will receive satisfaction from the first pages of the book. and this is by the fictitious cousin of Lemuel Gulliver, Richard Simpson. So this is the end of the first presentation on Gulliver's Travels. The second will look at the 4 journeys and just a really brief summary of the foci of each journey.